Okay, so far in the course, we've talked about a lot of parts of the world where either colonialism or dysfunctional governments have never allowed the countries to to maximize their potential. We've talked about, they've got natural resources, but they don't have infrastructure, and the government doesn't have the money to pay for the infrastructure. All these kind of dysfunctional problems. Now we're turning to East Asia, and East Asia has a lot of things going for it, if you've not read the papers recently. So we really want to dig in here and think about, we've already talked about India and how India's economy is on the ascent, and what it really lacks is manufacturing. Well, China is leaps and bounds ahead of India when it comes to manufacturing. And I really want you to focus on how China has set the stage for its economic development uh, through a lot of government intervention. So keep that in mind. Also think about when we talk about Japan, how Japan seemed to be the dominant rising star in the world economy 30, 40 years ago, and how things have changed for Japan's economic landscape. Okay, this image really shows the interesting geography of East Asia. Notice that a large part of Western China is kind of plateau and mountainous region. Of course, that's all as a result of the Indian subcontinent still driving northward, creating the Himalayas. So a lot of topography here, and then of course, then you have desert regions and a very large coastal plain for China. And of course, we also can't forget the Sichuan, the basin here, kind of a huge natural amphitheater where like 125 million people live in that relatively small area. Of course, in addition to China, we have to talk about the Korean Peninsula, very interesting geography there, and of course, the island nation of Japan, which, because of its essentially being built on volcanic islands, really has, for its size, not a whole lot of livable space. A lot of it is mountainous terrain that's generally uninhabitable. And that makes, of course, the population and the population density even greater because there's more limited areas to live in. A lot of the names we're familiar with, Peking and Canton and Tianjin, are actually British kind of mishearings of Chinese names for various cities during the colonial period. And once the colonial period ended and the communist regime took over in 1958, a lot of those names reverted to the actual Chinese names using a Northern Mandarin language. So instead of Peking, you have Beijing. Instead of Canton, you have Guangzhou. And also, one thing that's interesting in this is to realize that the way Chinese write their names, the last name is written first. So President Xi Jinping his last name is actually Xi, or Xi, Xi. So he's Mr. Xi. So my name would be Mr. Well, it would usually be Swanson Bob would be the way it would be said if in Chinese. Clearly, China is the elephant in the room when it comes to East Asia. It's dominant in area and population. It's the biggest economic driver, and because of all those things, of course, politically, it's the dominant region. Now, that hasn't always been the case. It has a long history as a civilization, and has waxed and waned, and has been colonial, and then has been colonized. But right now, it is certainly on a very large upswing. Some of the continued active geography or geology in this region, of course, we've got the Chinese plateau region, still home to frequent earthquakes. as there's still, remember that the Indian subcontinent continues to move and build those Himalayas, and so there's still faults and folds and earthquakes. Also, of course, we have to think about the earthquake and volcano, more earthquake issue in Japan, as we have an oceanic plate subducting beneath a continental plate, forming the Japanese islands. And because of the population density, because people live close to the coast in Japan, because there are nuclear reactors in Japan, all those things have to be considered when you're also talking about active geology. Now, I visited Japan back in 1998, and I actually flew into Tokyo and then took the bullet train, the Shinkansen, all the way up to Sendai. I had a friend who was living and teaching in Sendai, so I spent about a week in Sendai. Last thing on my mind was, of course, the earthquake threat, but sure enough, in 2011, there was an earthquake that occurred off the coast. It was centered off the coast of Sendai, and sent a huge tsunami along the eastern coast of Japan. We talked a few slides ago about essentially the large coastal plain region of Japan. Very crucial because, of course, that's where most of the population lives. It's where a lot of your agriculture is also occurring. And it's not to say that this western part of China is worthless. It's got a lot of natural resources, and part of the challenge is how to support and equally distribute wealth to people who live further inland, as well as how to have access. You got to still build infrastructure in order to access some of these natural resources. And this map just certainly brings to the fore the population density in the eastern part of China. And of course, you can see with Japan, obviously a huge population for a relatively small land area, particularly when you take into consideration that a lot of the interior of the country is essentially not habitable. Most population lives along the coast. Okay, in addition to the active geology, also want to talk about some of the physical features of the East Asia region. Of course, you can see these stripes of blue here, some of the major river systems that make up China. The Three Gorges Dam area, which you'll read about in the textbook. Of course, these are very important not only for irrigation, obviously for potable water for a large population, and of course for generating electricity for the increasing demands for electricity in China. So we have the big rivers in China. We have peninsulas, of course. The Korean Peninsula is a very important geopolitical location. We also have a lot of islands. You've got, of course, we've already talked about Japan, Taiwan, and then a lot of small islands which are actually in dispute. There's a lot of disputes between Japan, the Koreas, Russia, China over who owns some of these small islands. One of the biggest issues for the 21st century is going to be the fact that we have huge populations, both in Japan as well as, of course, in China, and we've already mentioned India, and they're increasingly leading first world lifestyles, and therefore you're going to have a huge environmental issue as the 21st century continues. We've already, if you watched the Olympics from a couple of years ago, there were issues as far as smog in the Chinese cities, and that is going to only become a bigger issue as the century progresses. Okay, so this is a nice map comparison between natural resources on the left and population distribution on the right. And clearly you can see how Chinese population is clustered on the eastern half of the country. You can see the population distribution there in the Korean Peninsula. As we've talked about in Japan, most of the population is close to the coast. Taiwan, even Hainan Island down there. But one thing you will note in the resources is that while there are all kinds of mineral and metal resources, notice that there's not a whole lot in the way of gas fields, oil fields, coal fields. This is one area where East Asia really needs the rest of the world, because despite the energy demands of this region, they are relatively poor. The supplies in those fossil fuels are relatively modest. And so you'll also notice, especially in the Korean Peninsula and in Japan, how they have turned to nuclear to supplement their energy needs. So a couple of questions to think about are, what comparisons can be made between the location of natural resources and the location of people? And finally, on the population cluster map, pick out the four most clustered areas, and what do all four have in common? But I encourage you to read about this very historic city and how it was key in the development of communist thinking in the 20th century. Much like my lack of knowledge in some of the British royal families, I don't know a whole lot about the British monarchy, especially when you get further and further back in time. If you think about China, some of the civilization, the Chinese civilization is thought to have sort of gotten itself together around 6000 BC. And for a long time, it was dominated by essentially dynasties. We're going to learn more about those dynasties on the next page. But one of the longest lived dynasties was the Han Dynasty, and therefore when we think about ethnic Chinese, they're sometimes called the people of Han. The highlights from, say, the Zhao Dynasty, chopsticks actually came to the fore during the time of the Zhao Dynasty, and of course the Great Wall of China. The construction was started, and you can see this red line indicates the location of the Great Wall. The Han Dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty, and of course then the Ming Dynasty and I assume it's pronounced Qing Dynasty. Confucius was a teacher in ancient China. He was born in 551 BC, died in 479 BC. And one of his main thoughts, revolutionary thoughts, was essentially that he abhorred supernatural mysticism and didn't buy into the supposed divine ancestries of some of the aristocratic rulers of his time. He didn't see these people as being anything other than just human. And his idea and his teaching was that human virtues, not godly connections, should determine a person's place in society. And so he didn't like the mingling of the supernatural with the civil. And his teachings were codified into what are called the classics. And these were essentially the guide for education in China for about 2,000 years until the Communist Revolution. When they took over in 1949, essentially they attacked Confucian thought on all fronts, and the classics were essentially abandoned. Okay, so this slide sort of shows how the Chinese Empire, which at one time had been so great and majestic, was essentially reduced to being partitioned into colonial states by the 19th century. So you can see the British influence and Russians and Japanese and French and Germans all had now a stake in the country. And the book mentions something called extraterritoriality, which is essentially that once these colonial powers were in charge, they were not subject, and the foreigners living in China and Korea, etc., were not subject to the local laws, so they could essentially do whatever they wanted to. As part of this extraterritoriality, as the little box mentions, the best residential, not only port areas, but also the best residential suburbs of large cities were declared to be extraterritorial and made inaccessible to Chinese citizens. So in the city of Guangzhou, Xiaomian Island in the Pearl River was a favorite extraterritorial enclave. A sign that the only bridge to the island stated, in English and Cantonese, no dogs or Chinese. That's kind of the heart of extraterritoriality, and obviously that's a system that cannot last long. Out of the disarray that was 19th century China came a revolutionary China in the 20th century. But what is sometimes overlooked is the fact that this actually started as two different groups, essentially the nationalists and the communists, who worked together initially, but then wound up being at odds as the country evolved. So now we move on to looking at some of Japan's historical background. And for centuries, Japan was essentially isolationist. There was very little interaction with the outside world. That started to change in the 19th century with what is called the Meiji Restoration, the return of enlightened rule focused on the Emperor Meiji. And this turned Japan away from isolationism and aimed at rapid modernization. And essentially Japan was emulating what Britain had done, which made a lot of sense because Britain is an island nation, Japan is an island nation. And in order for either of those countries to grow, they need to interact with the rest of the world. Following the modernization of Japan came the ideas of empire, imperialism. As Japan expanded its territory until, notice this line here indicates the Japanese holdings as of December 7th, 1941, which date should ring a bell. That is when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Honolulu. Eventually they would actually expand their territory as far as this line here, before the American forces and the Allied forces got involved in the Pacific and eventually drove Japan back. All too often, communism is kind of written off in the West as being just a faulty ideology. However, it's important to understand the benefit, the societal benefit that a communist government brought to post-World War II China. Clearly, the society was in disarray. The government was corrupt, which is why that's where revolution comes from. And so the communist regime, as is mentioned in the book, dictatorial and brutal though it was, did attack Chinese weaknesses and improve things in some cases. Land was confiscated from the wealthy, farms were collectivized, dams and levees were built with the hands of thousands. The threat of hunger for millions receded. Health conditions improved, child labor was reduced, and literacy was encouraged. So those were some of the upside to communist rule. Obviously, there was a lot of downside as well, as is detailed in the section about the Great Leap Forward. Another dark period in China's recent history is what was the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, sometimes just called the Cultural Revolution, which occurred in the last decade of Mao's reign, 1966 to 1976. It occurred in response to Mao's concern that Maoist communism was being contaminated. And so what Mao did was he essentially unleashed a vicious campaign against what he viewed as emerging elitism in society. He essentially went after and had the Red Guards and such go after intellectuals, dissidents, artists, anybody who opposed the Maoist view of communism were essentially rounded up. And hand in hand with that, Mao also essentially ramped up the cult of personality. Now, what a cult of personality is when an individual, in this case Mao, uses mass media, propaganda, or other methods to create an idealized, heroic, and at times worshipful image. It's similar to divinization, essentially making oneself divine, except that it is established by mass media and propaganda, usually by the state, especially in totalitarian and sometimes authoritarian states. The top one is about the Peace Memorial Park Museum in Hiroshima, which I've actually gotten a chance to visit when I visited Japan in 1998. I went to the Peace Memorial Park, and it was really a humbling experience to be there, especially as an American, to walk those grounds. But notice in this slide that after World War II, Japan, as part of the terms of surrender, had to accept a new constitution, which included a reduction in military. Essentially, Japan could not rebuild its military to what it had been. Therefore, it needed to have essentially the U.S. and other allied forces as its bodyguards because it couldn't create its own military. And therefore, all that energy which had been spent in militarism and imperialism was then shifted to focus on economic prowess, which was the story for essentially the second half of the 20th century in Japan. Okay, this animation doesn't have a whole lot to do with actually talking about the clash of ideologies, but it does have you put cities in East Asia in their appropriate places, which is kind of good, especially with those cities that we hear a lot about, but don't necessarily know the exact locations. After World War II, as was already mentioned, by treaty, Japan had to change its focus from imperialism and military buildup toward technological innovation, which it certainly did and benefited from as it quickly ascended and became one of the world's economic powers. Over the last 20 years, however, it's essentially been in a long malaise, essentially a recession that's been ongoing, which is the causes of which are more detailed in the next chapter. But suffice it to say, a lot of the rest of East Asia opened up and caught up. And that's been part of the problem, has been additional competition from some of its neighbors in trading on the world stage. And speaking of this competition, these other nations are essentially, they've been called the Asian tigers. And they followed the Japanese model. They use similar strategies of encouraging foreign investment and eventually creating they're not just areas where outside countries can come in and exploit them for their resources, but rather they are manufacturers themselves of high value added goods, which can then be used to trade on the world stage. Okay, and of course with China, it's a slightly different model because it is purportedly and for government control purposes a communist country. However, China has learned lessons from its own history. The fact that the communist model was not good as far as producing innovation and making the country competitive on a world scale. So it has embodied elements of capitalism within the confines of communism. Part of the question is how long can it continue to do so with a country that is so large, so populous, and as we see, increasing amounts of inequity between the rich and the poor in that country. One thing that can't be overlooked in our study of East Asia is the fact that there are long-standing animosities between many of these countries. The Korean Peninsula, for example, is divided into North Korea and South Korea, which we'll talk about in a second. Japan and China also have bones of contention. A lot of it stemming from Japanese imperialism and a lot of the atrocities visited upon the Chinese mainland by Japanese occupiers. So this area, these islands between Japan and China, are still areas that both countries claim. They're not inhabitable. They're not large islands, but and there's people don't live there, but they're still an important territorial region, as well as, of course, in order to have once you establish that your country owns or possesses these islands, then you possess the waters nearby, and those waters nearby potentially could be oil and gas sources. So there's economic and political reasons for the ongoing tension over these islands. In a similar fashion, between North Korea and South Korea, there are still territorial concerns, islands that are in dispute. And of course, North Korea being a nuclear power, there's always the threat of nuclear war of the North against the South. And it's a very interesting read. Taiwan, at least modern Taiwan, essentially came to be out of the ongoing fight, the struggle in mainland China between the nationalists and the communists. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, were essentially driven from mainland China, wound up in Taiwan. That's where they established their government, which they called the Republic of China. And that was originally recognized by the world community as the official government. Of course, that did not last long, over several decades, as mainland China started to open up more toward the West. The People's Republic of China became the internationally recognized China, with Taiwan being sort of a wayward province. The fortunes of China and Japan have always seemed to be inversely related. We're going to look at this more in next chapter. When one was rising, the other was in decline. So that's very interesting. Also, of course, we've already learned that East Asia constitutes the biggest manufacturing complex in the world, but the realm's natural resources are limited. So East Asia needs the world, and the world needs East Asia. The huge populations there are potential markets for Western nations. So the two need each other economically, and it's a matter of can East Asia and the rest of the world get along politically. Okay, so we start out with a nice compare and contrast between China and the United States. Notice here's the United States, at least the continental United States. We're not including Hawaii and Alaska in this case, but the size is very comparable. But think about the difference in the populations. China, 1,364,000,000 people. What's the U.S.? Well, probably give or take a billion. You know, take away a billion, and we're in the ballpark of the U.S. population. So a huge disparity in the populations, disparity in the type of government as well. Whereas the U.S. is a liberal, secular democracy, the People's Republic of China is a communist government. So it's got 4 central government municipalities, it's got 22 provinces, it's got 2 special administrative regions and 5 autonomous regions, but autonomous is really to be taken there with a big grain of salt. So we'll be discussing that a little later on in this chapter. This 4.5-minute video is well worth watching. It's about a filmmaker who spent about 1.5 years going across China trying to document a lot of the traditional cultures while he still could, because as China continues to open up to the West and these traditional regions are being exposed to Western culture, their cultures are disappearing, they're changing. And so it's a very interesting insight into how people have lived for a long time, but how these ways are changing rapidly due to Westernization. It is the capital of China. It's got a population of about 17.4 million. And as the box explains, Beijing was settled thousands of years ago and has been the capital for many, many of the governments that have ruled China, a lot of the dynasties. Now, there has been occasional movement, but even recently in the 20th century, the nationalists chose a southern capital, but then the communists prevailed in 1949, and they immediately reestablished Beijing as their and China's headquarters. China is a communist country. 20th century China went through a communist revolution. And so what that means is that there's a lot of control by the centralized government. But where China has been successful in is that it has turned communism shifted it a little bit and allowed for more capitalism, having learned lessons from the Great Leap Forward. The Great Leap Forward, again, was mentioned in Chapter 9a. Essentially, it was to enforce labor-intensive industrialization through the compulsory enlistment of large rural populations. So essentially, the government just rounded up people from the countryside and forced them to labor, to build factories, to build centralized industries. And what that wound up occurring was that there were inferior industrial products and a horrific disruption of agriculture. All those farmers were taken off the land and put to work, and nothing really worked out of all that. So instead, cues were taken from the Asian tigers from Japan, and that is, of course, an opening up to the West also was very important in the early 70s in bringing China finally forward out of the Great Leap Forward. Now, one thing that is not perhaps stressed enough in the book are the many human rights issues that China has, that the West has criticized China for. China is, again, not a democracy. It is a communist state, and that means a lot of centralized control, and it is not comfortable with the same amount of freedoms that a liberal democracy demands. The citizens of a liberal democracy are used to freedoms that are essentially built into the Constitution. China has no such constitution. So when the government decides that it can impose a limit on the number of children in order to control the population of the country, that's fair game in China. It is also open to scrutiny from outside. So certainly what the population control program has done in China is that it has turned this country, which had an out-of-control population. It had a population that was really large and a productivity per individual which was very low. That's a third world kind of setup. It has limited the population, and productivity has increased at the same time. So now the large population is not quite as much of a damper to economic productivity. So it had the desired economic effect, but as we discussed when talking about South Asia, part of the problem now is that population pyramid, the fact that now you're going to, as time goes on, you're going to have more people, more old Chinese than there will be young Chinese. And that's going to be a problem as far as just maintaining social order in such a structure. And one thing I'll also note that was discussed again in the chapters that we were discussing South Asia is that quite often as countries become economically successful, population control almost kind of comes about by itself, just organically. People increase their levels of education. They don't absolutely need to have a bunch of children to work the land. As the economy becomes less agricultural and becomes more urban, the population almost becomes self-controlling as many parents decide not to have large families in order to be able to give more to a smaller number of progeny. So anyway, that's something that's also worth thinking about is, do you need to have government control dictating how many children, or does the market almost control itself? Is described the hukao system, which actually has its roots long before communism came to China. But it's essentially a system of state-controlled incentives. Essentially, it's the state has some say as to where you live, where you go to school, what your job is, that sort of thing. So it seems like a limitation of freedoms that many democratic societies would not stand for. But it has been able to redirect populations into cities. And so this policy has helped China grow economically much quicker than it would have just organically. Okay, one of the essential parts of the economic engineering that has helped China's rise are what are called special economic zones. And these are areas where special incentives have been offered to businesses, to foreign investment, to build these large cities. And notice the placement of these cities. Of course, it's, they're on the coastal plain, but they're also, of course, they've got access to the ocean. And that's very important because these were essentially industrial centers set up to do business with the rest of the world. This is the largest city in China, and it has also benefited from large investments to modernize it. It's got a brand new airport. It's got a maglev train that connects the airport to the city. The train can actually go 267 miles per hour. It shows some of these huge urban developments that are in process, and the fact that China could be facing a real estate bubble similar to that was faced in the U.S. in the late 2000s, where there was more volume than there was demand. That there was a lot of speculation, a lot of speculation when it came to developers, and speculation when it came to investors purchasing properties, assuming that the values of those properties would continue to go up and up and up. Essentially, that you would just be buying equity, and that model sort of fell apart due to a lot of lax lending in the U.S. banking system. Similar issue could occur in China as well. Okay, on this slide, we see one of the challenges for China going forward, which is how to spread the wealth, essentially, how to share the economic benefits and the economic growth seen by these SEZ regions, and how to move that further inland, how to expand on the successes on the coast and bring the rest of the country ahead economically the way the coast has improved economically. Okay, so I encourage you to check out this animation as it shows the disparity in GDP, gross domestic product, in the various provinces in China. Now think back also to chapter 9a when it mentioned like Taiwan. Taiwan has a much higher GDP. Why is it? Its economy is much smaller, but per person, per capita, the wealth is more evenly distributed. Whereas in China, the inland provinces are definitely lagging behind. And the question is, how long can that go on? And the people in the inland provinces not revolt. So, there's always a concern when you have a huge inequality, inequity. No matter what your system of government, there's always the concern for revolution. Okay, so speaking of China's interior, we start up in the northeast. And the northeast region at one time was called Manchuria, and had gotten a lot of push early on. Manufacturing centers were set up by the early communist government because of the mineral wealth and the relative amount of fossil fuel wealth in this region. But essentially it had kind of fallen into disarray and disrepair, sometimes called the Rust Belt. But in more recent years, the more modern Chinese government has come to realize that this is an area of great potential economically. Central China has a very varied geography and a very varied population, therefore. The western parts of central China essentially bump up against Mongolia, Tibet. They're very sparsely populated. A lot of these are kind of desert regions. But then you also have more, you have what's called the Loess Plateau, which is very productive agriculturally. And central China even extends into the northern part of the Sichuan Basin. So again, that's where you have a lot more agriculture and therefore a lot more population and productivity. Okay, the southern part of China's interior this is essentially a border area that bumps up against Vietnam and Laos. It's got a lot of high relief topography. That means a lot of mountains, because of course the Indian subcontinent smashing into South Asia, creating the Himalayas and the Yunnan Plateau, which is where this region is kind of centered on. Even a Westerner who does not know that much about the internal politics in China is at least familiar with the situation in Tibet, or Xizang, a province that has been wanting independence. The Dalai Lama, who is the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhists, of whom the culture is largely made from, the Dalai Lama has wanted independence for Tibet. China is not interested in doing that, in allowing for that independence. And part of the reason is because of the, first of all, water. The headwaters for some of the major rivers in China is in Tibet. The Tibetan Plateau is sometimes referred to as China's water tower. So that's one of the reasons why China has a vested interest in this province. Similarly, it also borders on India. And so controlling that land is very important to China. Of course, independence is important to some of the Buddhist monks who live in Tibet. Between 2010 and 2013, over 100 self-immolation suicides took place, protesting the Chinese occupation and the marginalization of Tibetan culture in schools and the destruction of the Tibetan landscape through mining. So it's a hot topic, especially when it comes to human rights issues within China. Okay, and finally, another Western periphery state is Xinjiang. It's an autonomous region, with autonomy being sort of a loaded word here. Again, it's under Chinese government control. But one of the challenges, of course, is not only the disparity in economic opportunities here in one of these interior provinces compared to the coastal provinces, but also the difference in the cultural and ethnic makeup of the residents, and the desire on the part of the Chinese government to Hanification for this region. I do encourage you to read the section, the closing paragraph on page 502, which really talks about the challenges that China still has in front of it. Largely, whether to continue to adhere to its socialist principles. Again, with this continued disparity between those who are enjoying the benefits of a more capitalized socialism, and the real ideologues who would want to rein things in and share the wealth, as it were. Okay, Mongolia, which at one time was a proud and powerful nation, essentially has become a buffer state between Russia and China, mostly nomadic and agricultural and herding. But things are changing a bit as China continues to become more involved with it and investing more and more, largely to exploit it for its natural resources. And so that's one of the problems. Mongolia is, again, more of a third world nation and is at risk of being exploited by a much more powerful neighbor, where any riches, any proceeds that come from greater trade and interaction with China most likely will be limited to a very small population within Mongolia. Okay, so we move on to the Korean Peninsula, and the Korean Peninsula, of course, was the site of the Korean War back in the 50s, or the Korean police action or military action, which eventually resulted in dividing the peninsula into the north and southern portions, this line being the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. And as it's already been mentioned, South Korea has prospered since the end of the hostilities are still there, but the actual active war is long past. South Korea has become a democracy and has enjoyed great economic strides. North Korea is essentially an autocracy, a dictatorship, and as was mentioned, has suffered from malnutrition um, and economic malaise for decades. What is interesting is despite the differences ideologically, the two Koreas need each other. I think the North Korea needing South Korea a little more than vice versa because of the number of international sanctions that have been imposed on North Korea by the rest of the world. So North Korea definitely needs South Korea for food. South Korea needs North Korea for raw materials because South Korea has become such a huge manufacturing power. Is despite all the economic success that the country has enjoyed, the South Korea success story is almost entirely male. The percentage of women gainfully employed in South Korea is not representative of a developed economy. The number of women in senior positions is far lower. And it's located almost smack dab in the middle of, or at least the west central part of the Korean Peninsula, which then situates it in the northwest part of South Korea. But it is a thoroughly modern city, population nearly 10 million, and one of its keys to success, continued success, will be increasing growth in its infrastructure. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, I actually had the chance to visit Japan back in 1998, and I flew from Seoul, South Korea. It was just a little stopover into Tokyo, into the Narita Airport in Tokyo. I took the bullet train, the Shinkansen, up to Sendai. Spent several days in Sendai. From Sendai, I took the Shinkansen again back down south, all the way out here to Hiroshima. That's where I visited the Peace Memorial Park. Spent a couple days in Hiroshima, then headed back north, spent a couple days in Kyoto, before eventually going back to Tokyo to fly back home. Okay, so how did Japan become such an economic power following World War II? Well, first of all, the placement of a lot of its development gives it plenty of coastal ports. So it was well suited for international trade. And as your book mentions on page 507, the country defeated the odds by calling on old Japanese virtues: organizational efficiency, massive productivity, dedication to quality, and tight adherence to common goals. Okay, here's some questions to ask yourself, especially when you look at the number of nuclear plants. Notice the nuclear plants are symbolized there with a little cooling tower. Looking at the location of nuclear reactors in Japan, how do these compare to population centers? And if a reactor leaks, as one did after the 2011 earthquake, what kind of problems will Japan experience environmentally? As has already been mentioned, Japan had been isolationist for centuries, but once it was able to shake off those tendencies in the 19th century under the Meiji dynasty, things were able to change quite rapidly, and that was partly due to the harnessing of a cultural tradition in which common interest is elevated above individual interest. And one example of this from my experience in Japan was sick people in Japan. If you've got a cold, sick people will identify themselves by wearing a face mask, like a doctor face mask, essentially telling other people around them that, hey, I'm sick. I don't want to pass along my sickness to you. And of course, that means that the individual is willing to walk around kind of looking silly for the better, in the interest of others. And that may be due, I've thought about this, it may be due to the fact that it is an island nation. And clearly an epidemic is more likely to spread rapidly due to the population density of Japan. So maybe that has a little bit to do with it, thinking about the common good rather than the individual interest. But in any case, using that cultural tradition was able to essentially fuel and spark the economic development of Japan from the mid 20th century on. And that was despite some challenges. The fact that Japan does not have that much in the way of fossil fuels. And so being a manufacturing nation, it needed energy. But with no oil and gas, what did it do? It developed nuclear energy. Because it doesn't have as many resources, it needed to import a lot of stuff. And so in order to do that, it had to produce high quality, high value goods in order to get the resources and the food as imports. All right, this is a very cool video, and I mean that. It's about how to make things popular, and the one particular company in Japan called Takara, who tries to stay on top of the toy industry by innovating, producing new products, trying to make sure that at least one in a great number actually catch on. We've already talked about the fact that most of the development in Japan occurs along the coast, and as these cities sprawl, they actually have to reclaim land from the water. It's a lot easier to sort of build outward and upward than to try to build inland. Now, one of the challenges for Japan is that it is, over the last 20 years, after a period of great growth, has seen essentially no growth over the last 20 years. Part of it has to do with lack of adaptability, and also a shifting demographic, where essentially Japan is becoming an older nation. And so there's going to be a challenge in providing social services to an increasingly graying population. And of course, like I said, the challenge of the other Asian tigers who have in many cases co-opted the Japanese model, and they've been able to produce equally good products, manufacture them with a lower cost. And so Japan has seen its market share dwindle over time. Of course, Japan also has some natural challenges. The fact that it has done so much development into nuclear power, and that obviously became a problem in 2011. The earthquake just off the coast of Sendai produced a tsunami that damaged a nuclear power plant, so it became an environmental disaster. So now Japan is starting to look more toward geothermal power to continue to fuel its economic growth. Taiwan, as was mentioned earlier, was essentially where the nationalists retreated to in the late 40s as the communists took over mainland China. And for years, Taiwan has essentially wanted independence. Now it is becoming so economically tied into some of the SEZs on the southeast coast of China that there's a little less push for independence and more of a push toward an arrangement similar to that Hong Kong has, kind of a one nation, two systems, a special administrative region, which allows Taiwan the benefits of the economic linkages to mainland China, but also gives it a little more in the way of freedoms that mainland China does not experience.